My name is David Merritt, and I'm a riparian ecologist with the USDA Forest Service for a group called the National Stream and Aquatic Ecology Center. I think I've always had kind of a innate interest in science. Really got turned on to environmental issues as a child on the Alabama River. My father had a boat and we used to go around, and I actually did some school projects sampling water at different tributaries and looking at the difference in chemistry in the water. The biggest challenge that I am trying to address with my work is to understand how humans and human population growth and climate change are compatible with functioning river systems. And increasingly, the free-flowing rivers are under demand for development. And so balancing supplying those demands with maintaining functioning ecosystems is really a driver in my career. I think the most gratifying project that I've worked on was to work within the state water laws, work with the big water users and the water providers in Arizona, and develop a perpetual protection of minimum flows in a stream. And so that was fairly gratifying, in large part because of the people involved and the resource that was protected.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Noah Ami. I'm a graduate student here in Forest Sciences, and today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Merritt. Dr. Merritt is a riparian plant ecologist working with the Forest Service, and he is also affiliate scientist and graduate student advisor here at CSU. He's primarily focused on studying how the physical flow regimes of rivers interact with riparian plant diversity and functionality. And so I'm very excited to hear a hydrology talk today and see some pictures of rivers. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Merritt.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you so much, Noah, and thanks to all of you for inviting me here today. So this is a bit of an unconventional scientific talk. It's got a little bit of what I would consider art to it as well. And there's a lot of information in here, so I hope I'm not sort of overwhelming you, but I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about what our group does, familiarizing you with the Forest Service's riparian program, and then I'm going to get into sort of talking about what it is that really attracts me to rivers, and then get into a couple of case studies. One that's completely finished, and it's an environmental flow study. How much water does a river need? And then I'm going to finish with a study that's underway that I'm really excited about. And so with that, our group is the National Stream and Aquatic Ecology Center. We're a national group in the Forest Service. Our headquarters is in DC. And on our team are an interdisciplinary group of scientists, most of which are PhDs or masters level folks. We have Dan Cinderelli, who's a geomorphologist, does a lot of aquatic organism passage nationwide, a lot of training and engineering on that. Myself and Lindsay Reynolds, who's a postdoc with our group, are riparian ecologists. We've got an aquatic ecologist that studies mostly inland fish and Pacific fish and does a lot of stuff with the National Environmental Policy Act and that kind of thing. We've got a hydrologist, Steve Yoakum, who's a graduate of CSU here, who does a lot of river restoration and advising people on river channel design and whatnot. We've got a hydrologic technician, Julian Scott, who's here today. A lot more than a hydrologic technician. He does a lot of GIS, geospatial analysis, statistics, great hydrologist. And from within that, I run the riparian program, and the riparian program, the bread and butter is really the environmental flow determination. So we get involved with a lot of litigation and legal disputes over water, mostly in the western U.S. where it's the most scarce. And the first week I came on the job, I got involved with a lawsuit and scared the pants off of me, but it also kind of hardened me for some of the things to come. We also developed national protocols for measuring and monitoring riparian areas. We do a bit of river restoration, mostly advising people on riparian plantings and things like that, as well as environmental flows as a passive means of restoring river functions. So again, a lot of litigation science support. I'm working on wild and scenic rivers right now, quantifying flows for wilderness areas in the Sky Islands in Arizona. And it's all very interesting and super challenging. It's the hardest science, I've ever done. Part of what we do is provide guidebooks and communicate with forest practitioners about how they can go out and measure and how they can characterize and quantify riparian areas, stream side, vegetation, and all of the component species and biochemical processes that happen within them. Again, a paper that has kind of become a little bit of a passion for me has been this riparian flow response guilds as a means of characterizing and quantifying flow regimes necessary to support functioning riparian ecosystems, and I'm going to come back to that as well. So I've had the great good fortune to be able to visit all of these incredible river systems, and it's given me a real appreciation for the fact that every single river I visit is different, and I learn something from every single one. And this is the poster children of the places that I'm working right now across the western U.S., and it's Cherry Creek, it's Grand Canyon, the Upper Snake River headwaters in Wyoming, and Yellowstone and Grand Teton, Fossil Creek, which is an incredible gin clear creek that had a dam removed recently and has all of the Colorado native fish restocked in there. And then we've got the Verde River in Arizona. I'm working on a project with Aaron Cubley and David Cooper in this department, quantifying flows for that. And there's the Purgatory River. So these are just among some of the rivers that I'm fortunately working in right now, and love every one of them. And they are the most biologically diverse elements of the landscape anywhere you go in the world. And it's because of their complexity, and it's because of the processes that drive them and the adaptations of the animals and plants that live in them. So particularly in these arid landscapes, the collection of creatures, of animals and insects and birds in these riparian areas are just astounding. And down in the Sky Islands, some of the neotropical birds just blow your mind. And so I always like to start my talks by saying, riparian vegetation kind of is what we appreciate about rivers and riparian areas. They are the source of food for the aquatic food web. They're the carbon. They're the structure. They're pollen and nuts and berries and fruit and cavities for nesters and treetops and forage for herbivores. And so riparian areas and riparian vegetation and the combination of species that occur there really determine the characteristics of river ecosystems. So this is the part of the talk that's a little unconventional. One of my mentors was Leroy Poff, and back in the 90s he published a paper with a bunch of colleagues about the natural flow regime paradigm. And it's really it's an important paradigm, and it's an important thing to be reminded of. But the thing that makes rivers across this diverse western landscape so diverse is the flow regimes, the master variable, the way water melts or rains from the sky or comes from the groundwater and forms these ecosystems. And so I put together a little slideshow of different hydrologic regimes across the West. So this is the Poudre in 2013. This is the Yampa River. It's primarily a snowmelt-driven stream, very predictable flows within a 3-week period of the springtime. The Verde River, which receives a little bit of snowmelt, but it's a lot of monsoon floods in the late summer and in the winter. Coastal rivers that have, again, monsoonal and winter storms that come off the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico and are very flashy and very dynamic, but dry for most of the year. And down in the Sky Islands, where I've just started to work and become really interested, the configuration of mountains across the Sonoran Desert really determines how much snow these places accumulate, and it determines upslope and convective storms, and it really creates different organisms, different communities of organisms in different Sky Islands around what they call the archipelago down there. So this is the artistic part. I hope that these work. For years I've been trying to communicate this passion of rivers to people, and talking about a hydrologic regime and all the statistics around a hydrologic regime is really fun for scientists, but sometimes it's hard to convey how beautiful the annual hydrograph of a river is. So what I have done is basically converted hydrologic regimes into music. And so this is a a symphony of the Yampa River in 1984. And you'll notice that the river is actually playing every note. So I converted daily average flows into MIDI notes and then ran it through an instrument. And I want you to notice the difference in a snowmelt hydrograph. And then the descending limb and the tension goes away. And at low flows, most of these rivers at low flow sound very similar. And this is the Verde River. So this is the snowmelt-driven system that then experiences these late season big pulses in flow. Sounds similar. That largest peak there was a flash flood event that killed a family of 4. This is the Cache La Poudre River in 2013. This is the biggest flood of historical record on the Cache La Poudre River, and it was associated with a 4-day period of time where we got all of our annual precipitation in a course of just a few hours. So this is the snowmelt portion of the hydrograph right here. So this is the big flood. So I don't know. I've had to listen to all of my favorite rivers at this point, and I'm going to play you one more. It's kind of a tension breaker, but this is the point of this is that these communities form around these river systems, and these floods, these extreme events, really produce the selective pressures that have actually sculpted some pretty cool organisms. This is a 3-spine stickleback on the Santa Margarita River, which is another river that Lindsay and I are working on. And if you put a little Afro-Cuban beat to it and make the river play the trumpet, so the funnest thing about this was really getting a distinct difference in the hydrologic regimes of these river systems. So in addition to this geographic symphony of different hydrologic regimes and just functionally different flow patterns and timings, within a particular river system, there's a tremendous amount of variability as well. So this is the Yampa River. The biggest flood is that 1984 flood, but look at the range of flows around that. So this really accommodates lots more organisms through time than just a big event that accommodates cottonwood trees or a big event that accommodates a bony-tailed chub. So the interannual variability is key to these river systems. Also, the geography that they flow through. You think about the Colorado River flowing across the big plains of the Palo Verde Valley and down to the Delta of Mexico, and then you think of it flowing through the Grand Canyon. And it's the same flow regime, it's just flowing through vastly different landscapes, and so it's producing functionally different ecosystems. Here's an example of, even within a reach of river, the complexity that goes on. So you imagine this is the Santa Margarita River, the Afro-Cubano Beat River, and this is a hydraulic model. The little arrows are velocity vectors, and you look at the complexity over the course of a flood in this river system of these hydraulic patterns and these different shear stresses and different places where sediment is deposited and scoured, and it just gives you a sense of the fantastic complexity and the uniqueness of not only every river, but every spot along a river, every reach along a river is so different. And so it makes it really hard to wrap your mind around how to study rivers and how to figure out how much water they need, and to be able to defend that in court to 5% around a mean or whatever. So what I've done with my career is really look for commonalities in rivers. So the things that really make all rivers similar are the processes that you can use to try to define what they need. So all rivers drain the landscape, they form networks, they're interconnected, they collect carbon and water and seeds and propagules and organisms and move them down towards the sea. So that's one commonality, is this connectivity. It's amazing that the biological diversity, the probability or likelihood of high diversity increases downstream because rivers are accumulating seeds and propagules and organisms all through all the subwatersheds of a river system. Another thing that is common to all rivers is they have really steep gradients of moisture availability. So plants near the river have a lot of moisture. Plants far from the river have less, particularly in arid landscapes. And the other factor is fluvial disturbance. So water-related, flow-related disturbance is also unique to river systems. And it comes in all shapes, sizes, and forms, from direct shear against a plant's stem to causing hydraulic roughness and causing sediment to be deposited, scour. It's a very universal process in river systems. And so these streamflow attributes really exert selective pressures on the organisms. So they have to either, to live along a river system, you have to either be able to endure, or you have to avoid, or you have to be resilient. And a lot of the organisms I work with are resilient. A lot of the plants that grow along rivers can get sheared off completely and just resprout from a sprout. Other animals avoid it entirely by remaining dormant during the floods, during the big periods of disturbance. So there are a lot of stressors, but those are the things that really are common to river systems. Again, they exert selective pressures and have caused evolutionary adaptations to specific river flow regimes and specific hydraulic settings. I love this perch from Australia, and it lives in perennial rivers that experience catastrophic floods. And that fish will produce eggs and be ready to go if there's a catastrophic flood, and if there isn't a catastrophic flood, it'll reabsorb the eggs. And that's just an adaptation to where it lives. So the more you look into it, the more interesting it gets. So in the United States, there are about 6 million kilometers of rivers, 3.5 million miles of rivers. And the Forest Service, the agency I work with, manages about 640,000 kilometers of rivers and streams. And one of the things that we have to factor into all of our environmental assessments and trying to maintain multiple uses on public lands are dams. And dams and diversions are a ubiquitous feature of these systems. There are about 800,000 dams worldwide. There are 90,000 as of the last national inventory of dams. And according to a colleague, Dave Theobald, he has quantified that there are about 400,000 reservoirs, places where water is detained on the landscape that historically it didn't exist. And this is a picture of the national inventory of dams. So this is the 90,000 dams greater than 2 meters tall that basically alter all the processes that I talked about that are common to all river systems. So they disconnect them longitudinally, they affect the amount of sediment flowing down them, they affect the peaks of the floods and the timings of the floods, and they affect the low flows, so the water availability. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's very deliberate. I mean, we built dams to store water when it's abundant and deliver it when it's scarce. So we really understand the effects of dams and diversions. It's many of the things that I just mentioned, this longitudinal and lateral disconnectivity of a river and its floodplain. And importantly, from an evolutionary standpoint, dams can decouple the organisms from the things that they've spent millennia, tens of thousands of years evolving to. So that fish with a gut full of eggs, when you cut those floods off in perpetuity and store them in reservoirs, you're greatly affecting the life history and creating a bottleneck in that organism's life cycle. So one of the biggest things that dams do is cause simplification of habitat. So we wrote a paper back in the early 2000s or mid 2000s about homogenization of streamflow regimes caused by regulation, river regulation, and found that indeed we are homogenizing. We're taking this diverse landscape and this diverse set of hydrologic regimes around the country and around the world, and causing those rivers to be more similar to one another. So we're taking away this fundamental heterogeneity from the landscape. So again, I'm going to come back a little bit to my geeked out musical thing, and this is an example of a river before and after regulation. So this is the sound of a regulated river, and imagine if you were a razorback sucker that had a keeled back waiting for these big sediment-laden floods of all this snowmelt pouring off the Rocky Mountains, and you get to honker down and you've got a perfectly hydraulic feature on your back that pushes you against the bed of the stream, and you can endure that thing, and then your river is dammed, and now it's clear and it's cold water, and the peak flows are less, and the sidearm connectivity is less. So in 1962, the Flaming Gorge Dam went in. It was built and went in on the Green River, another big tributary of the Colorado, with similar flows to the Yampa. And this is what it sounded like in 1962, right before the dam went in. Big snowmelt peak, and then it descends into the low flow season. What happens in 1965? So this is after they filled the reservoir. The first years after they put the reservoir in, it was pretty abysmal as they were filling it. This is pretty typical for the last 25 years after they put the dam in. So you get the point. It's still a symphony, but it's mostly low brass and timpani. And it now supports a gold medal trout fishery downstream from that dam. So just to get a handle on the regional kind of ubiquity of dams, I thought I would give people access to this. Disappearing West, Dave Theobald and his group over at Conservation Science Partners put together some online interactive tools where you can go look at your river, see how much of the annual hydrograph can be stored in reservoirs on that river, and they've classed rivers all across the western United States according to their condition. So, not to beleaguer the point, the effects of flow alteration are well documented. The effects of dams have caused the decline in freshwater species at faster rates than terrestrial species worldwide, according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. But isn't it amazing that in the Missouri River, less than a 4-hour drive from here, we still share the earth with creatures like that? Giant paddlefish and sturgeon. Fantastic, and really evolved for those big rivers and big floods. So the pressure in the future for western rivers is kind of scary. So I hope I can end this with kind of a high note. I've got a long ways to go, but there was a recent report that came out by Department of Energy basically saying all of the potential for developing hydropower to meet our future energy demands in the United States. And they've shown that basically we could generate almost double of what we do right now by developing out all the planned developments on non-federally protected rivers. And that's a lot of additional dams. Some of those were proposed in ideal locations like in Grand Canyon and whatnot, but that doubling of our gigawatt capacity for hydropower generation is from just dams that are eligible, or just rivers that are eligible for development, which is kind of scary. And this just shows you sort of how those are distributed. There's a lot in the Rocky Mountains, places where you could put a high head dam, a lot in the Pacific Northwest. So the threat is certainly there. So this kind of like is the segue into what we do at the center and what I do and my colleagues do, including many that are here today. The challenge facing us is to define ecosystem needs clearly enough to guide policy formulation and management actions that balance competing demands and visions. So this is very explicitly including humans. This is not a tree hugging conservation thing to be compelled for. It is trying to balance human needs by understanding what the minimum amount of water necessary for a river to be a river. And there's a guy who's going to be here in a couple of weeks, Brian Richter, who's done a lot of real spearheading work in trying to figure out how you scale down a river and what you gain and what you lose by doing so. This is an example right here of the historic hydrograph in gray and how you could peel off water for people while maintaining peak flows for habitat and sidearm connectivity and maintaining those late season monsoon floods, at least one of them out of 4, and storing the rest for humans. So there is a compatibility at some levels. So for me, when I first came on to this job, my boss didn't really know that much about plant ecology, and he said, so we need to figure out how much water rivers need. And I was like, are you talking about like river ecosystems? Or are you talking about like specific species? And he's like, I don't know, you tell me. So I've spent like the last 20 years trying to figure out, well, do we quantify flows at an ecosystem scale? Do we do it by classifying communities and trying to protect certain representative or rare community types? Do we look at species or populations? And that brought me to an age-old concept of functional groups and guilds, which I'll get into later. Some of the most straightforward approaches to characterizing flow regime for rivers are to harken back to Leroy Poff's natural flow regime and basically do statistical approaches to characterizing the flow regimes and linking them to key ecological attributes. And we've been doing this on several streams from the north up at the Snake River down to the Sky Islands, and that is to look at what are the typical flow regimes that can be predicted on particular years. There's high snowpack years, there's La Nina events, so break years into a whole time series of hydrologic regimes, break that into meaningful, representative hydrographs. Take that and you can fit a function to it. You can know that, a high snowpack year, we can trigger and manage below a dam for a particular flow regime. This is one way we've gone about it, and for a lot of the streams we work on, they're ungauged, and so we have to use. We don't often have these nice hydrographs to then synthesize a hydrograph out of. We have to use regional regression equations that the USGS puts together, and we have to come up with key critical components of the hydrologic regime. So this is 3 hydrographs that you could actually file in court for that characterize the 1-day event, the 3-day high, the 7-day high, the 30-day, and the 90-day high flow. And then you can say, those are key elements timed at the perfect time, and those are going to accommodate that whole suite of ecosystem functions out there. And you can also get artistic with it and kind of like taper them or do other things that are more natural than a vertical descending limb of a hydrograph. This to me looks like some kind of a weird Scientology icon. But these are real, and these you can file in federal court for a Lorentzian function that describes a hydrograph and then have that administered. And so that's what we're experimenting with right now and trying to use first order principles to link the aspects of those to basic concepts like decomposition. We know that's important. We know channel maintenance is important. We know that low flows that maintain pools free of ice in the wintertime are key. So this is an actual method working at the ecosystem level that will probably go to court at some point and be challenged. I'm a much more detail-oriented person, and so I've for years been hanging my hat on, you look at individual species and you look at their entire life cycle, you look at how that life cycle is connected to aspects of the flow regime, and then you accommodate that species. And then I visited more rivers and thought a little bit more about it, and because rivers are comprised of so many species, if you manage a hydrograph to accommodate a species and their life cycle, you're leaving a lot of people out of the game, a lot of organisms out of the game. So with all the different hydrologic regimes and all the different organisms, how do you summarize that? One of the ways we've tried to do it is to get real heady and spend hours in R trying to figure out how to use network theory, ecological theory, a lot of these academic concepts to try to illustrate what happens, what is it about all these elements of an ecosystem that fit them together in response to hydrologic regimes. So this is a bunch of these are guilds of riparian plants and how they are interrelated and interact and the strengths of their interactions under a natural flow regime. And then we're able to game that and increase drought frequency or decrease the magnitude of flood events and come up with a really pretty spaghetti diagram that shows us that simplifies the system. Kind of hard to convey to a dam operator and to the general public at large in a compelling way that gets them to really want to protect that spaghetti bowl, but effective and reflects reality. So what I became really interested in is trying to take this complex, the most biologically diverse systems and classify them so that we can get our minds around them and accommodate classes of organisms rather than individual organisms. And so on the shoulders of Christian Ronquier and Paul Ketty and Philip Grimes, some of the originators or at least formalizers of looking at functional traits of plants and grouping them according to their functionality and tying them together based on their physical attributes, measurable physical attributes that you can measure. Things for me, things for us that relate to the things that make rivers unique and individualized. And that is things like water availability and fluvial disturbance. So what we've done is developed an approach with a lot of collaborators. Tom Kolb down at Northern Arizona University. Lindsay Reynolds is working on a project that we're doing this right now. Aaron Cubley. And we're working with colleagues to develop approaches to looking at measurable traits of plants and then grouping plants according to their similarities and differences, and then modeling that as a function of river flow regime. So I can go into details of that later. The basic concept is you take these species that you understand and that you can measure, and you abstract them to non-taxonomic groupings of plants that respond to aspects of the flow regime in similar ways. So all of a sudden you've accommodated a flow regime that accommodates 25 species. So for example, in the Grand Canyon there are about 350 vascular plants that grow along the riparian zone. We've grouped them into 17 guilds of species that we can then model and look at many fewer models and convey to some of the stakeholders like the Hopi tribe and the Navajo something that's meaningful with regard to how to manage the river. And the way we do it is kind of a complicated thing, but we do classification using ordination and cluster analysis. We empirically figure out how those species are distributed according to a hydrograph, and again, this is the Yampa River hydrograph. We come up with metrics and measures that characterize those hydrologic regimes across the floodplain, and then we can model those species. So this modeled surface basically shows the probability of this particular guild of species occurring along these gradients. And then we can take these gradients and adjust them and see how an altered flow regime, a restored flow regime, if you just leave things the way they are, the likelihood that things are going to stay the same or be different. So here's an example of a gilding that we did, which Julie Stromberg and myself did it for the Sonoran Desert. And it's essentially a cluster analysis that separates these plants based on those traits, those characteristics of leaf area, the mass of their seeds, which is an indication of how well they can colonize after a disturbance, and how well dispersed they are. The ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in their leaves, that's a good measure of their water use efficiency, how able they are to deal with drought conditions, how adept they are at dealing with flooding and drought. So these are examples across the bottom of some of the guilds that we developed for the Sonoran Desert. The hope is that these guilds will be universal, so that you can go to a different river system like the Colorado River or like the Santa Margarita out in California, and that generally those rivers, because they possess the same properties of flooding and steep water availability gradients, that we'll have hydro-riparian pioneer trees there. And they'll be comprised of a different cast of characters, but they will be responding to similar aspects of the flow regime. And we're finding this to be true. We're finding that these guilds of species are some of them are fairly ubiquitous. Some of them don't exist on systems that have been heavily regulated for 40 years. perhaps they could be introduced. So by doing this regional gilding, we're going to have the ability to predict, if you change the flow regime in this way, we could see the introduction of this very important functional gild in your system. So this is a case study. This is a done deal. This is a little wilderness stream in Arizona. It's a perennial stream about 300 miles from Phoenix in the middle of nowhere. It's a tributary of the Salt River, which feeds into the Salt River Project, which is the biggest water provider in Phoenix, the greater Phoenix area. And it's a stream that the Tonto National Forest, some great people on the forest, decided to take advantage of the state's in-stream flow program, which is right there on their website. You can file for in-stream flows to protect this stream. And they went and they followed the guidelines. They went out and made a bunch of measurements, did some flow measurements, and filed for an in-stream flow water right for Cherry Creek, in the middle of nowhere. The biggest copper mining company in the world came in and said, no, you can't. You can't issue water rights to a federal agency. And they sued the state. And it went to the Supreme Court in the state, and the state won. The state was able to, with their water, which they have jurisdiction over water, allow a user, a conservation group, a federal agency to hold the water rights for an in-stream flow water right. So these guys went in and they filed for the right, went to Supreme Court, they lost. So this mining company decided to sue the Forest Service, and they basically sued the Forest Service and the state for, or threatened to, for trying to keep water in this stream. And so that caused about 10 years of work, and that's what I'm going to present right now, just a little flash in the pan of some of that work. So we went out to try to really link ecological processes to flow in that stream and show that those minimum flows weren't even what the river needed to maintain its functionality. Those minimum flows were just life support for the system. So we went out with some colleagues at the U.S. Geological Survey. They did intensive field studies, developed two-dimensional hydraulic models for us from which we could pull things like shear stress across the entire floodplain. We installed groundwater wells in a grid up and down this reach to get depth to water table and to see how that fluctuated. And then we modeled plants, guilds of plants, as a function of those hydrologic factors. So water availability, in this case it was depth to water table, and fluvial disturbance, in this case was the velocity of flow over every single point on that floodplain at a really rare high magnitude event. So we were able to produce these probabilistic models that predict the presence or absence, predict the probability of occurrence of a particular gild, and we did this with like 7 gilds, across this depth to water table gradient. Some of the species in this particular gild, the one I'm going to show you is the Hydro-riparian pioneer tree. It's comprised of these broadleaf deciduous plants that would not occur in this landscape at all if it weren't for shallow water tables. So cottonwood, Gooding willow, yeah, these forests are pretty amazing. So what we did was we modeled the present day distribution based on those plots, and those plots, I should explain, the green ones are the presence of that gild and the black ones are the absence of that gild. And we had about 120 plots out there that we were able to model. So we were able to validate our models based on the actual presences versus the predicted presences. And so this is a map of the Hydro-riparian tree gild on the floodplain at Cherry Creek. And this shows that if groundwater were lowered at half-meter intervals, 2 meters of groundwater decline, and this river supplies that groundwater. So if you depleted that river and caused a 2-meter decline in groundwater, you'd have about an 80% reduction in this incredibly valuable ribbon of green that supports all of these birds and animals and insects out in this system. So it would be greatly depleted. So we're able to summarize that as kind of a decision support tool. Look at, as you incrementally game the system and reduce the water table, reduce the magnitude of these high velocity flood events, you cause a reduction in that hydro-riparian tree gild at the expense of this xero-riparian or really dry shrub gild. So what this is saying is that you lose riparian forest dominance in the riparian area and essentially create a valley bottom that's very similar to the uplands around it. So you lose the uniqueness and all of the functions provided by that river system. And we wanted to kind of do a so what on it so that when this went to court, we could say, well, that actually does matter because those areas support different communities than the desert shrublands. And so we essentially went out and independently measured the structure of the habitat and the provisions of the habitat, and developed a bird habitat index that ranges from 0 to 1, 1 being the most complex multi-canopy layers, diverse riparian vegetation. And we found that that index was strongly related to the presence of these hydroriparian trees. So basically, using the hydroriparian trees, you could make a prediction of the habitat structure. So we took the actual habitat, the measured habitat structure, and sent some ornithologists out with a random selection of our plots, and they found that bird diversity was strongly related. So they had no knowledge of what we were even doing. They just went out and measured birds out in the field over 2 seasons on Cherry Creek, and found that, in fact, the bird habitat index is highly related to bird habitat diversity. So to maintain habitat diversity in such a system, you need to maintain functional diversity. You need to maintain deciduous riparian vegetation. And so that vegetation is highly dependent upon the water that stream provides. So this was going to be our compelling argument for protecting the minimum amount of water in Cherry Creek. Just an interesting aside here is, it was interesting, we tried to compare species diversity to the functional diversity or the structural diversity of these areas. So this is how many guilds a particular plot had relative to the number of species it had. And in large part, the more species you have, the more guilds are possible within a plot. But it was interesting to see that even at low species diversity, you could have high functional diversity. And even at high species diversity, you could have relatively low functional diversity. And that's because some of these systems have very similar guilds. They're exploiting different resources, but they are functionally very similar. And so you think about a very diverse mesic meadow, and it's just got a bunch of grasses and forbs. It doesn't have that tree component. So even though it's got high diversity, it's got low functional diversity, which means little for birds. And this comes back to interesting ecological theories about niche partitioning and limiting similarity and things like that. But you have to basically possess different strategies for acquiring water and dealing with fluvial disturbance as a plant to be able to coexist. So we're about to apply this technique on the Verde River, and we're actually going to deploy acoustic monitors to monitor the birds acoustically, in addition to having the ornithologists go out there, which is kind of exciting because sonically you can actually identify a bird by the frequency and the notes that it sings. So this is basically the historical hydrograph of Cherry Creek. Catastrophic big years, low years. Well, under the state guidelines, you have to apply for median monthly flow, and that's what the forest applied for. That's the maintenance flows that look like this. And the scariest part about it is, this is a big victory that this isn't being opposed and that we actually got a certified water right for this. But look at the dynamism of the former system relative to this, and look at the scales. So it's kind of wild, but this is now a bona fide water right, and in perpetuity, Cherry Creek is going to receive that much water as a minimum, and that will be protected from all future water development. So I just got this last week. This has been like a 10-year project. So the next thing I want to show you is just another application of this in a beautiful place, and then I'll end with some scary statistics, and then hopefully an optimistic note. So also been applying this in the Grand Canyon, Arizona. Spectacular gorge, one of the most spectacular spots in the West. And it's in the Colorado River Basin that we enjoy water from. Back in 1869, the Colorado River Basin had 1 dam in it on the Manti La Salle National Forest. It now has about 1,700 dams throughout it. It's a heavily regulated basin, highly important to Western water. And look at this phenomenal engineering feat. This is a cork in a massive river system that drains a huge percentage of the western U.S. A lot of snow-capped peaks run into Lake Powell and stop right there at the Glen Canyon Dam. And how is that dam managed and how is water downstream determined? Well, it's determined by a panel of stakeholders. And these stakeholders consist of Native Americans, they consist of water users, the water development community, business people, federal agencies, and they essentially get together with all the scientific information and decide whether the flow is going to look like that or whether the flow is going to look like that. And they're a bit encumbered by some federal laws that protect endangered fish and some big uses of the river, which includes recreation. So we kind of piggybacked onto a trip, and this includes Julian Scott and myself. Lindsay's been down into the canyon. And we piggybacked on a Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center program that had been in place since the mid-90s to try to characterize and quantify how much water the river needs and how to maintain the functions of that river, one of the big ones being rafting. So we went out to 42 different bars along the Colorado River and applied the same technique, where we went out, we measured plants and plots, we characterized the exceedance probability, or the probability of any point on the floodplain being flooded at any point in time, and then went and produced these probabilistic maps for gills throughout the Grand Canyon. And this is a work in progress, but it's just amazing the scale that we're working at. And 42 bars sounds like a lot. It's a huge data set, but you look at it relative to the scale of these canyons, it's pretty amazing. But hopefully we'll produce compelling results looking at how to manage for desirable plant communities along Grand Canyon. And so what we've got now is we've got these maps of the weather forecast for different flow scenarios in Grand Canyon. So this is if they decide to implement a high peak again, reminiscent of a dwarfed version of a pre-dam peak, that can actually maintain the channel, maintain a wider, bigger channel, maintain disturbance next to the channel, and produces a little bit lower cover of this particular hydrophytic disturbance gild. A stabilized flow, which is what the Glen Canyon was for years after Glen Canyon Dam went in, there was a tremendous increase in wetland communities down through the Grand Canyon, in part because of the stabilized low flows, reduced peak flows, but also because the river no longer had the competence to blow out these debris fans from side canyons and tributaries, and so extensive marsh systems formed on those tributaries. So again, we're developing a decision support tool so that a stakeholder group like that could sit down and say, what are the consequences of this flow versus that flow, in a very spectacular place. One of the neat things we're doing, and I think in the light of time I'm not going to show this, is we're using our models and we're backcasting. We're using images that have been taken since the 90s to say, can we predict what vegetation should have been there 25 years ago? And then we can take that imagery mosaic and move it backwards and look at what was there 20 years ago. Oop. So the bulk of all this is we are trying, you know, the academic side of my brain really loves the spaghetti bowl, and the management side of my brain really wants to be able to communicate more effectively and clearly. And so we're currently working with, our group is working with the USGS, Chris Holmquist Johnson and his crew, to develop decision support tools that are graphic user interface, easy to understand, they map things in a spatial way, in a realistic way on a landscape, and allow you to make decisions based on as good a science as possible. And so Chris Holmquist Johnson and his group have developed this over at the USGS here in Fort Collins, and we are trying to now add a riparian component to make the riparian work that I do and our group does a little bit more accessible and digestible. So what is the future of Western rivers? This is from a Bureau of Reclamation document. It basically shows that in 2008 we already outstrapped the supply of water on average from the water systems that supply the Front Range of Colorado and most of the western United States. These big cities are continuing to grow at really rapid rates. I found this in a Colorado-based publication that a former Denver water employee put out and some other water conservation folks put out, and it basically shows that by 2020, we are going to outstrap our water supply completely. And even if all of the proposed dams and water storage facilities that are currently on the books for development are built, including Glade Reservoir and whatnot, we will be exceeding given these different climate change and growth scenarios, our water use by as much as 3 times. That means we could need in the future on the Front Range of Colorado 3 more Denver waters. That much water. So where we're going to get that and how rivers are going to be able to be protected through such a increase in demand without an increase in supply is really kind of a scary thought for rivers and river conservation. This is the same document that graph came from, that the Bureau of Reclamation was really brainstorming and looking to scientists to help come up with ways how are we going to meet this increased demand and decrease in supply. And I just wanted to point this out because it's amazing. Imports to Southern California via icebergs, cloud seeding, imports to the Colorado Front Range from the Missouri or Mississippi rivers, controlling phreatophytes, so plants that live along rivers. And a lot of this also, really is pretty conventional. Save water. Don't waste water on bluegrass lawns and golf courses, Don't waste water. That will increase our supply. But it's really kind of wild because all of us that have lived here for more than 10 years have seen in the last 5 years some really appreciable changes in the population here. So this has a long and reaching effect. The water that we consume affects the Colorado River and the Colorado River Delta. And this is kind of a poetic view from Aldo Leopold from a canoe trip down there of what the Colorado River Delta used to look like, with jaguar and migratory birds and fleets of cormorants. And this is what it looks like today. This is the trickle of water that reaches the Colorado River Delta in the Gulf of California. The odd thing about it is that with all of its writhings and foamings and spectacular rapids, they all lead to nothing. The river rises in the Rockies, thunders through the canyons, and is so used by mankind that when it reaches the Gulf of California, 1,400 miles from its source, it literally trickles into the sea. So that's really sad to me. I end with a proposal that, as with Aldo Leopold's land ethic, where we see rivers as inherently valuable in our landscape, that we become proponents of a river ethic, of a very ethic that protects rivers from being dried out. Because right now, throughout the West, drying out a river completely is completely legal, and it's happening all over the place. So in Australia, they actually put rivers into their constitution. Rivers have a constitutional right to be rivers, even at a minimal sense. So I just like to engage people in a dialogue about having a river ethic, because I think that's the only way we're going to have rivers in the future, given the demand and climate change. So with that, be open to any questions or comments. That depressing, huh? Yes?
Dave, I'm just curious, do you know of any cloud seeding operations that are actually going on, and how viable is that? Like, are people shooting silver iodide?
Yeah, it works. It's happening in Arizona,
okay.
And I've heard about it happening in Colorado. I think Denver Water has actually done it over the mountains.
I was reading a book once, and I read an anecdote of somebody who did that actually a long time ago, cloud seeded in San Diego, and some floods came and he got run out of town.
Oh yeah? That's funny. Huh, that's classic. Don't seed our clouds. Yeah, I astound at that Bureau of Rec report, because I mean, really, if you think about it, we were able to pipe a valuable commodity, oil, from Alaska to the lower 48. Water's next. Water's big, and there's a guy named Million here in Colorado, lives in Fort Collins or Loveland, who has proposed an 800-mile pipeline from the Flaming Gorge Dam to the Front Range to provide water, because there are years when we don't meet our total storage and our allotment in the Colorado River Compact. So on high snowpack years, we actually lose some water that we could actually be storing and using to Utah and to all the organisms from here down to the Delta. And so there's very likely going to be some proposals to store that water, and some of the biggest candidates are like the Yampa River, that first symphony that I showed with all those native fish that are still there. And yeah. So with that, yeah. Yes?
So you talked some about sort of classifying red herring vegetation into different guilds. I'm wondering also about the sort of jurisdictional element across different rivers, maybe across some of the different national forests on which those rivers are located. I mean, state water rights is one sort of aspect to it. What other sort of political factors, or how do political factors shape sort of the likelihood of some of these conservation measures happening, and sort of what up, in addition to sort of intervening with downstream flows, for instance, what are the other sort of essential points where some level of change could occur in terms of managing the river?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. It's all very political, and some of the biggest means, the strongest arms are federal laws that are usually coming into play after the system is so degraded that there's an endangerment or a threatened species that is very powerful, ESA. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is another federal legislated thing that protects rivers. I mean, you have to, the agencies that apply for and get granted a wild and scenic river status have to maintain the flows in that river to meet the standards under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. That's also very powerful. But as the public, I think the best way is to have a river ethic and to vote for people that understand that we need water. We need water to our municipalities, but we also need some limits on that sometimes, and we need to maintain the very reason people are moving to the Front Range, which is these river systems. I mean, politicians, even very conservative politicians, will embrace the idea of managing and maintaining these systems. I mean, John McCain in Arizona, I mean, you go to his website and he's very proud of the fact that he supported the designation of Fossil Creek as wild and scenic, and he supported the removal of a big dam. And that's been a very successful project. That river only has native fish, Colorado and Sonoran fish in it right now. So I think it's public participation, it's the collective individual actions of people, like not wasting water, and it's a very, very complicated issue that's very political. But the strongest arms are, you know, in Colorado right now, if you had the means, you could go apply for a minimum in-stream flow water right on any stream that you wanted to. You just have to quantify how much water that is, submit an application, and the state has a in-stream flow program that already protects like 8,000 miles of streams. So there, and Arizona, ironically, being the most arid state in the country, has some of the most liberal in-stream flow laws. Anybody can hold an in-stream flow water right. Yep.
Great talk. Really enjoyed your sonic interpretation of the hydrographs.
Oh, good.
Have you employed those in communicating with the public or research managers? And how did that go?
Until today, these had only been heard by me in my headphones in my basement at my house. And I told my friend Mike Scott, and he teared up because I told him I was just struggling with this for weeks. I've been thinking about it for years. And when I finally heard the Yampa River play the grand piano for the first time, I got chills. You know, I was really into it. So I hope that it's a viable way of communicating the complexity of rivers. I mean, I've had to go and listen to all my favorite rivers. I think the most beautiful symphony of all of them was the Vindel River in Sweden in 2004. Just crazy. So I've been going through and interviewing different water years. Yeah, Julian.
Sort of a comment, I guess. I know that in a courtroom setting, like providing this information to the judge is a challenge, and having him or her receive that information and understand it, make an educated sort of judgment is a real challenge because it's so far out of the realm. Maybe it seems likely that it's outside of the realm of their normal judgments. So on that, I've heard that there's a major court case ongoing or getting ready to be begin trying to hold accountable the oil industry for climate change impacts. And in preparation for this large case, they're holding a session of knowledge sharing and informing the parties, including the judge that's participating, prior to even holding this court case.
The oil industry is educating them? Is that what you said?
No, I think they're participating, but no, it's third parties and it's experts in the field that come to the table to provide this information prior to the actual event. That's sort of my rough understanding of it. But I just wonder if that's, I guess there's hope maybe that sets a precedent for creating greater literacy in this field in the judge courtrooms.
Yeah, I think it's a nice idea, and I think it's why we really need people like Karina, who's the communications person here in the stewardship department, to help us egghead scientists to better communicate without going over people's head or through them or around them. And it's the hardest thing for a lot of people that want to study the minute details of a little aquatic invertebrate. So really communication is key and education is key. So that's a good comment. All right. Well, thanks again. Appreciate you having me.